Welcome to the Biblical Perspectives for Leadership podcast, where timeless biblical truths meet modern leadership. We are thrilled to have you join us on this journey of exploring how biblical principles can guide us in leading with wisdom, integrity, and purpose. Whether you're leading in the church, your workplace, or your community, this podcast is designed to inspire, challenge, and equip you for the road ahead. Let's dive into today's conversation and discover how Scripture shapes the way we lead.
Welcome back to Biblical Perspectives for Leadership. Sometimes a story can really grab you and make you think about leadership in a whole new way.
Right.
Today we're diving deep into Genesis chapter 22, story of Abraham and Isaac, where God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son. It's a tough passage, but there's some surprising leadership nuggets buried within it.
Yeah, it's
What do you think?
It's interesting how this story challenges our assumptions about obedience, faith, and what it really means to lead. On the surface, it might just seem like a straightforward lesson in just following orders, but there's so much more to unpack here,
Okay, so let's set the scene. God tells Abraham to take Isaac, his son, his only son, who he loves, to the region of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering, Genesis chapter 22, verse 2. That's a pretty heavy command, right? And what's fascinating is Abraham's immediate response.
Right. He says, "Here I am."
Yeah.
And that's not just a casual, okay, I'm listening. The Hebrew word here is hineni. Oh, okay.
And it appears at these pivotal moments in the Bible, whenever God calls upon his servants.
Hineni. It's almost like a code word for I'm all in. Yeah. I'm ready for whatever comes next, no matter how difficult. Is that a fair interpretation?
Yeah, absolutely. It signifies complete submission and a readiness to act on God's command.
Wow.
So think about Moses at the burning bush, Exodus chapter 3, verse 4, or Samuel as a young boy in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 4.
Okay.
They both respond with hineni when God calls. It's a powerful statement of commitment.
So how does this hineni concept translate to leadership today? I mean, we don't want to encourage blind obedience in our teams.
Of course not. But hineni is more than just blind obedience. It's about cultivating a culture where people feel empowered to step up, to take ownership and to commit fully to the mission, even when they're faced with really challenging tasks.
So it's about creating an environment of trust where people feel safe to say, "Here I am, ready to contribute." I like that.
But back to Abraham, he sets out on this journey with Isaac. And I can't help but wonder about the weight of that 3-day trek. What must have been going through their minds?
Well, Genesis chapter 22, verse 7 gives us a little glimpse into their conversation.
Right.
Isaac innocently asks, "Father, where is the lamb for the burnt offering?"
And Abraham's response in verse 8 is both heartbreaking and so full of faith. He says, "God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." I mean, just wow.
That statement right there reveals so much about Abraham's leadership. It's about having that unwavering trust, even when the path ahead is uncertain, It's about believing in a higher purpose, even when you're faced with these seemingly impossible choices.
But isn't there a danger in that kind of blind faith? What if the higher purpose is, misguided or harmful?
Right.
Shouldn't leaders also be questioning, analyzing, and using your critical thinking skills?
You're absolutely right. It's not about blindly following orders. Abraham's trust wasn't naive. He had this history with God,
right?
A relationship built on promises and covenants. His faith was informed by experience and a deep understanding of God's character in leadership that translates to having a clear vision, strong values, and the wisdom to kind of discern the right path, even when it's really difficult.
So it's not just about saying yes. It's about saying yes to the things that align with your core values and your understanding of what's right and good.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
And remember, leadership isn't a solo act. Even in this deeply personal test, Abraham wasn't alone. He had his servants with him, people that he trusted to support him on this journey.
That's true. It's easy to overlook that detail, but it speaks volumes about delegation and building a strong team. Even when facing immense pressure, Abraham understood the importance of relying on others.
Precisely. Effective leaders know they can't do everything themselves. They empower their teams, they delegate responsibilities, and they trust others to contribute their skills and expertise.
Okay. So we've got Abraham traveling to Moriah with Isaac and his servants. What happens next? Because I know this story doesn't end with a pleasant picnic lunch.
You're right about that. Genesis chapter 22, verses 9 and 10 tell us that they arrive at the place that God had indicated.
Whoa.
Abraham builds an altar, arranges the wood, binds Isaac, and places him on the altar, on top of the wood.
Wow.
He's about to follow through with the unthinkable.
Talk about a dramatic climax. I mean, can you even imagine the emotional weight of that moment? The conflict between obedience and paternal love must have been like agonizing.
Absolutely. And this is where the story takes another turn.
Okay.
It forces us to confront some really tough questions about the nature of obedience and ethical boundaries.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What happens next?
Just as Abraham is about to sacrifice Isaac, an angel of the Lord calls out from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." You can almost hear the desperation in his voice.
It's like a last minute reprieve, a divine intervention that totally changes the course of the story. What does the angel say?
Genesis chapter 22, verse 12. The angel commands, "Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me."
Wow, talk about a close call. But this raises some really important questions about leadership, right? Where do we draw the line between obedience and our own ethical boundaries? How do we know when to push back even when the command is coming from someone we respect or a higher authority?
It's a delicate balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this story doesn't offer any easy answers, but it really highlights the importance of moral courage, of having the conviction to stand up for what we believe is right, even when it's really, really hard.
So it's not just about saying hineni, it's about being willing to say no when our conscience demands it. But how do we develop that kind of moral courage? It's easy to talk about it in theory, but in real life situations, it can be so incredibly challenging, especially when there's so much at stake.
It starts with knowing yourself, your values, your non-negotiables. What are the lines that you're not willing to cross no matter what? Once you have that internal compass, it becomes easier to navigate those really tricky ethical dilemmas.
This whole conversation reminds me of something you said earlier about Abraham's faith being informed by his experience. It wasn't just blind trust.
Right.
He had a history with God, a relationship built on promises and covenants.
Yeah.
For those unfamiliar, what exactly did this covenant thing mean for Abraham? Was it a formal contract with God?
It's more like a sacred agreement, a binding promise. In Genesis chapter 17, God establishes a covenant with Abraham.
Okay.
He promises to make him the father of many nations and to give his descendants the land of Canaan. It's a foundational story in the Bible, and it really shapes Abraham's understanding of his relationship with God.
So this covenant is like the bedrock of Abraham's faith.
Yeah.
It informs his decisions, his trust, and even his willingness to obey, even when the command seems impossible. But what's the leadership lesson here? Do we need to make literal covenants with our teams?
Not literal covenants, but we do need to establish clear expectations, shared values, and a sense of mutual commitment. When there's a strong foundation of trust and understanding, it becomes easier to navigate challenges together.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's get back to the story. God has intervened. Abraham has been spared the ultimate sacrifice. But what about the ram? Didn't God promise to provide a lamb for the offering?
Exactly. And here's where we see another really important leadership principle: resourcefulness.
Right.
Genesis chapter 22, verse 13, tells us that Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. He took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son.
So the ram appears at the last minute. It's like a symbol of unexpected provision, a solution that emerges when all hope seems lost.
Right.
But how do we translate that into practical leadership advice? Should we just wait for a metaphorical ram to magically appear when we're facing a crisis?
Of course not.
Yeah.
But it does speak to the importance of being adaptable, of being open to new possibilities, and of trusting that even in the most challenging situations, there might be a ram in the thicket waiting to be discovered.
It's like that saying, necessity is the mother of invention. When we're faced with a problem, our creative juices start flowing, and we often come up with solutions we never thought possible.
Exactly. And sometimes it's about leveraging the resources we already have, looking at things from a different perspective, or even just being willing to ask for help.
This whole story is a roller coaster of emotions, but it's also packed with leadership wisdom. We've talked about hineni, moral courage, informed trust, delegation, resourcefulness. What other leadership gems can we extract from this ancient tale?
Well, there's a crucial element we haven't discussed yet that kind of ties everything together: service.
Okay. I'm intrigued. How does the concept of service relate to this story of sacrifice and obedience? It seems like Abraham was primarily focused on following God's command.
Remember that God reaffirms his covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 22, verses 16 through 18. He says, "By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore. And thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice." This blessing wasn't just for Abraham personally, it had implications for all nations on earth.
So Abraham's actions weren't just about personal piety or blind obedience. They were part of a larger plan, a mission to bless all the nations of the earth.
Precisely. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, even though it ultimately wasn't required, demonstrates a profound understanding of service. His obedience wasn't for personal gain, but for a cause greater than himself.
That's a powerful insight. It reframes the entire story, doesn't it? It suggests that true leadership is not about self-promotion or accumulating power, but about using our influence to serve others to make a positive impact on the world around us.
And that's a message that resonates just as strongly today as it did thousands of years ago.
Absolutely. But before we get too carried away with these profound thoughts, let's pause for a moment to let our listeners absorb everything we've discussed so far. When we return, we'll wrap up our deep dive into this incredible story and explore how these ancient lessons can be applied to our modern lives. Welcome back to Biblical Perspectives for Leadership. We've been unpacking this story of Abraham and Isaac, and it's just amazing how much leadership wisdom we can glean from just this one passage.
Yeah, it's a story that just keeps revealing these new layers of meaning. We've talked about obedience, trust, resourcefulness, even the courage to question authority. But as we were discussing before, there's this deeper theme that really ties everything together: service.
Right. You were saying that Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac wasn't just about following orders, but about serving a purpose greater than himself. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah. Well, think about the context of the story, right? God promised Abraham that he will become the father of many nations, that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Genesis chapter 15, verse 5. This promise, this covenant, it forms the foundation of Abraham's faith and informs his understanding of leadership.
So it's not just about Abraham's personal relationship with God. It's about his role in a much larger story, a story that extends far beyond his own lifetime.
Exactly. His obedience, his willingness to sacrifice is ultimately an act of service. He's not doing it for personal gain or recognition, but for the fulfillment of God's promise, a promise that will ultimately bless all the nations of the earth.
That's a really powerful way to look at it. It's not about self-promotion or climbing the ladder of success. It's about using our influence, our talents, our resources to make a positive impact on the world around us.
And that concept of servant leadership, it's echoed throughout history. Think about leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa. They were all driven by this deep sense of purpose, a desire to serve humanity, to fight for justice, to alleviate suffering.
It's interesting how their leadership wasn't about wielding power over others, but about empowering others, about uplifting and inspiring those around them.
Exactly. And it's not just about these grand gestures or changing the world overnight. It's about the small, everyday acts of service, the choices we make that reflect our commitment to something larger than ourselves.
So it could be as simple as mentoring a colleague, volunteering in our community, or even just being a more present and supportive friend or family member.
Absolutely. Servant leadership isn't about titles or positions. It's about a way of being in the world. It's about approaching our interactions with humility, with empathy, and a genuine desire to make a difference.
This conversation has been so insightful. We started with a story about sacrifice and obedience, and we've ended up with this profound lesson about the power of servant leadership. It's amazing how these ancient texts can still, speak to us today, offering guidance and wisdom for our modern lives.
And that's the beauty of studying these biblical stories. They're not just historical accounts or religious doctrines. They're these timeless reflections on the human condition, on the challenges and triumphs of leadership, on the enduring power of faith and service.
As we wrap up this episode, what's the one thought you want to leave our listeners with?
I want you to consider this. How might these principles of trust, obedience, and sacrifice apply to your own leadership journey? What rams in the thicket could be waiting to be discovered if you just, remain open to divine guidance and provision? And how can you embrace the spirit of Hineni, not just as a statement of obedience, but as a commitment to serving a purpose greater than yourself?
Those are really powerful questions to ponder. Thank you so much for joining us on this Come Dive into Biblical Perspectives for Leadership. We hope you've been inspired and challenged to think about leadership in a whole new way. Until next time, may you find strength, wisdom, and the courage to lead with purpose and service.
Thank you for joining us on the Biblical Perspectives for Leadership podcast. I hope today's insights have encouraged and equipped you to lead with faith, wisdom, and purpose. Remember, the greatest leader of all time taught us that true leadership is about serving others. If you enjoyed this episode and podcast, be sure to subscribe, share it with others, and leave a review. It helps us reach more people with these transformative truths. Until next time, keep leading with grace and walking in purpose.